I'm Priscilla Barrera with the Investing News Network, and here with me today is Andrew Miller, who's Product Director at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right, so my first question for you today is, how are you finding sentiment towards the battery metal space this year so far, and here at PDAC?
I think, we're coming off a particularly tricky year for a lot of these battery materials. You've seen a bit of correction, particularly in pricing across the battery materials, and financing some new projects has obviously been very difficult in the current environment. So we're coming off the back of a tricky year. I think when you look longer term, for those that are committed to developing projects for the longer term, the outlook just continues to strengthen really, and you see that at an automotive level, a battery level, and ultimately those pressures need to see the development of new resources. I think now we're just in this transition period, and where people are trying to monitor the timing of those new projects and where the money comes from, and how quickly they're able to bring some of those to fruition.
All right, and a big topic here at the conference and obviously globally is the coronavirus. So I wanted to ask you, how do you expect that to impact the lithium-ion supply chains, and what lessons can we learn from that?
I think that really comes down to where we see how far this spreads, and the sort of timing of a lot of these issues. Within China and the hub of where this sort of outbreak began, there hasn't been a huge fundamental impact on production at this point. We were coming back off Chinese New Year, where things were very slow anyway, and then maybe the ramp up towards some of their production capacity has been slower than a lot would have expected in the battery metal space. But I think across the supply chain, you sort of have the counteracting force that a lot of that demand hasn't been there at the same time. I think what you really have to monitor over the next few weeks is what happens in Japan, South Korea, other areas of the world that are demanding some of these raw materials. At the moment, logistics seems to be a big, bottleneck for some of this Chinese supply chain, given what's happening there. So with China, particularly in the areas where China is a particularly dominant producer of the raw material, I think that's going to be a concern for the market moving forward. And particularly in areas like lithium hydroxide, for instance, where China has a very dominant position, we've already started to hear concerns, maybe not material lack of availability, but concerns over what this might mean for the coming months. So those are the areas we're watching pretty closely.
All right. And you're tracking, obviously, megafactories. You've been doing that for a while. Can you give us an update on how many megafactories you've been tracking so far? And I know we've talked before about the rise of Europe in terms of megafactories. What are some of the challenges that remain for that region going forward?
Sure. So, in terms of total megafactories, we're well over the 100 mark now, and in total over 2 terawatt hours of new capacity to coming into the market. So those continue to be announced, and really what we're seeing when you talk about Europe and also here in North America, the emphasis on developing new battery projects is really coming from the commitments of major OEMs downstream. So as you see more and more Western OEMs commit to electrification of their fleet, you're going to see more and more commitments to new battery capacity here in North America. More I expect in Europe, and you saw a huge amount of that last year, and other areas of the world. So we continue to see this roll out, and we continue to see even the established producers who have been more focused typically in Asia are definitely reaching further out now and looking where they best position their new plants going forward.
Mm-hmm. And would you say the challenges between Europe and the US, Canada are similar or different in some sense in terms of that?
Yeah, I'd say there's similarities. I think you've definitely seen a lot more activity on the European front, and you've probably overtaken the pace of North America to some extent. But you still, you have a big automotive industry here as you have in Europe, and that's really the driving force at the moment. The push towards electrification on that front has been a bit more pronounced from the European OEMs. But I think it's really just a timing issue, and it's this transition and building up supply chains to supply these markets that historically and to date have been very much Asia focused, and particularly China focused. So both are facing challenges on that front, and I think in different areas both are going to see particular challenges, but ultimately it's the process now of building out that supply chain, giving confidence from the end market level to make investments right through to the mine and the raw material. So that's a process we're going to see continue to develop over the next 5 to 10 years.
Right, and I wanted to touch on the anode response, and you mentioned yesterday at a presentation that outside of China the focus has been on future technologies. Do you actually think that outside of China Can they gain market share outside of China on the anode side of things?
So I think there's a lot of exciting work at an R&D level that's taking place outside of China. The use of silicon, lithium on the anode side of things, and various other technologies. Ultimately, I think where the market is today, and if you look at the time to commercialize these type of new technologies at scale, you are looking probably 5 to 10 years or more. So to challenge China's dominant position in this market is going to be very difficult. I think where there can be some real progress outside of China is in terms of developing within the existing infrastructure of the carbon-based natural synthetic graphite anode, and then looking at the introduction of additives like silicon into that, and how you can balance and use that, balance new materials into that existing technology. And again, like we've seen on the cathode side, we've seen more diversification now outside of China in the battery plants, and now the cathode manufacturing. Anode will follow in that trend, and there definitely is the push from downstream to locate more of your anode production facilities closer to where the battery production is taking place. So, new technology. I think North America in particular, there's some really exciting companies that are setting their case for how they're going to supply the future of the market. Where the market is today and will be for the next number of years is around those graphite-based anodes, where a bit more work needs to be done.
So then, talking about graphite specifically, what do you think remains a big challenge for junior graphite miners? And I also wanted to ask about your outlook for graphite in 2020. Has it changed based on the recent events that have developed?
Yes, I think the challenge for any new graphite operations at the moment is obviously you can't just be a raw material producer, and you need to be able to supply a number of different markets and refine your material. And really, where the best opportunity I think in the graphite market is today is to be a value-added graphite company, not just a concentrate producer, but take that through to the advanced materials that are needed, particularly in the battery supply chain. So that's a big challenge, and it's like it with a lot of these materials, it's bridging two sets of disciplines, and going from the mining mindset and the producers that are used to producing a concentrate, taking that and then making the refined material that can be qualified and meet battery grade standards is the challenge for any new producer, I think, that's targeting that segment of the market. In terms of the outlook for graphite, I think this year it hasn't changed fundamentally from where we see things at the moment. We're not seeing a huge amount of the raw material production at this point being impacted. We're still in that season in China where things are naturally just ramping up anyway, so we may see that come to fruition a bit more as you move towards the end of Q1. But at the moment, I think there's the availability of supply at a raw material level isn't the issue. What could potentially become an issue if any of those anode or spherical graphite producers in China are disrupted is the supply into the anode supply chain, and China plays a very crucial role, particularly on the natural graphite side of things, of producing spherical that goes into Japan and Korea. So we've heard so far there hasn't been too many disruption to deliveries to those areas, but if there is any impact on the projects, the spherical graphite projects in China, that could be a concern for Japan and Korea consumers over the coming months.
Great, and just switching gears for a second, looking at the cathode side of things, you mentioned yesterday you expect to see more consolidation in the space. What does that mean for raw materials, and do you expect that to happen at the raw material level?
Yes, I think in terms of the consolidation, and the consolidation in the cathode space I was talking about was really in terms of you've seen a huge number of new participants or small-scale participants in China, and I think as is the case in many steps in the supply chain in China, there is going to have to be some element of consolidation, and there'll be a small number of majors that will really emerge from that. The investments and the scale of the new plants continues to grow, and there is, as I mentioned before, the diversification into Europe. So I think on the cathode side of the supply chain, you still have, again, it's getting confidence from where the battery plants are being located as to where those will emerge. But you're already starting to see some of that with BASF and a few other companies. Was there another part to your question on the cathode?
No, on the cathode side, just what it meant for raw materials. But then let's touch on lithium specifically.
Yep.
Also wanted to ask you a similar question with graphite. Has your forecast changed? Are you still in a wait and see mode? How is it going to play out for lithium 2020?
So lithium, I think we are monitoring. I think you've really got to look at, and when you're trying to determine the balance of the lithium market moving forward, what's critical to look at is who can provide the battery grade chemicals, and that actually limits the number of companies that can really impact that or fundamentally impact that part of the supply chain quite dramatically. So when you look at those companies, the Chinese producers, to date we haven't heard of any real impact on production. They are again not at full capacity utilization, but ramping up and seem to be quite positive about their ability to continue producing. So we are waiting and monitoring that. Again, logistics seems to be the area that is more impacted, but to counteract that, you do now start to see some of the question marks arise over operations in Japan and Korea that may have been consuming some of that material. So we're waiting to see the balance at the moment. We're not seeing deliveries too materially impacted, maybe just some of the timing at this point. I think the question becomes how long does this go on for, and where does it spread to, as to what the longer term impact will be on lithium.
Right, and I know that we've talked before about the importance of partnerships, especially in the lithium space, to move those projects forward. Why do you think it's important when investors are looking at a company to think about, okay, who are they partnering with, or can they?
Yeah, well, definitely can they, because they need the customer, but who they partner with, I think, is really important, because you want a customer that can give you the confidence, one, that they're going to be able to consume the material that you're producing in the offtake, but also giving you the clear guidelines as to what type of product they want. There is no one type of lithium being used in the supply chain, for instance, so it's really about refining your material and working with your end user to give them a consistent and reliable product that will meet their specifications and their needs. And I think that's not just at a raw material to cathode level. I think that you see that emerging across the supply chain with some of the announcements between cathode producers and battery producers, and obviously battery producers and automotive manufacturers. So partnerships are key, particularly at this point in the market, because margins are tightening for a lot of the producers in the supply chain. They don't maybe have the ability to expand, and the risk is, if you don't have a confirmed partner, or at least a solid commitment to buying your material, then you're most likely not going to invest the types of money needed at this stage to meet the major demand growth coming. So it's about giving confidence along that supply chain. I think that's what's really critical at this point, particularly with the money maybe not coming into the sector as quickly as some areas need.
Right, and my last question for you today, Andy. We've seen a lot of the big miners starting to pledge to reduce their emissions. They divested their coal assets. They've tried to get into the battery metal space. When are we going to see that happen with maybe big oil companies, and what are the challenges that remain for big oil companies if they want to get into this space?
So I think we're already starting to see the interest, and a benchmark. We've been speaking at a number of oil events recently, and just to see that industry, which I think a few years ago would have been very opposing ends of this discussion, but now they're very open and receptive to seeing how what is the opportunity to maybe diversify away and actually tap into an area of the market that might grow as other growth areas in oil might be a bit limited. But also perhaps use some of their skills and expertise on the extractive side as an industry that does have huge amounts of capital that it could invest in other areas, looking at some of the opportunities that that might be coming up at the moment. So I think we've already started to see, and you've seen some of the statements already publicly, but certainly in terms of, I think anecdotally, and what you see from when we speak to some of the oil companies, is a real active interest in this space. What is the challenge? I do think, again, it's as for big bulk commodity companies to move into this space, it's all about the refining and the working with your battery end users. But ultimately, I suppose oil already has that, have a lot of those relationships further downstream, certainly, and they're used to extractives and refining. So, I think it's an interesting area, and lots of new areas are going to have to emerge to fund this whole supply chain moving forward. And whether it's from the oil sector, whether it's from technology, whether it's from other areas of that have the types of capital needed to sustain the supply chain, I think you're going to see lots of different types of people start moving into this space.
Great, Andy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
And once again, I'm Priscilla Barrera with the Investing News Network, and here with me today was Andrew Miller, Product Director at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence.